People rarely laugh because they know the truth. Most of the time, they laugh because they think they do. The community center buzzed with conversation beneath bright fluorescent lights as folding chairs filled the large multipurpose room. Children ran between tables covered with homemade desserts while volunteers prepared banners for the annual Fall Harvest Festival. In the small town of Cedar Grove, events like this brought everyone together. At least that was the idea. Rachel Morgan stood near the back of the room arranging donation forms while keeping one eye on her 12-year-old daughter, Emma, who was helping decorate a display board with autumn leaves cut from colored paper. The sight brought a smile to Rachel's face. Emma had inherited her determination. Life had never been easy for either of them, but somehow they always found reasons to keep moving forward. Rachel adjusted a stack of papers and checked the clock on the wall. She still had to finish her shift at the grocery store later that evening. Before that, she needed to help clean up after the meeting and make sure Emma completed her science project before school the next morning. Her days often felt like a puzzle made of responsibilities. Every hour mattered. Every dollar mattered. Every decision mattered. Across the room, a group of women gathered around a refreshment table. Their voices remained low enough to appear polite but loud enough to be overheard. Rachel had become familiar with that particular volume. It was the volume people used when they wanted someone to hear them without having to take responsibility for what they said. Linda Parker stood at the center of the group. She wore an expensive sweater, carried herself with confidence, and seemed to know something about everyone in town. "I heard Rachel picked up another evening shift," Linda remarked while stirring her coffee. One woman nodded sympathetically. Another tried not to react. "She works so much," someone added. Linda shrugged. "Well, that is what happens when you end up alone." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. Rachel continued organizing paperwork as though she had heard nothing. Years earlier, comments like that would have ruined her day. Now they mostly made her tired. People loved simple stories. Divorced mother. Struggling financially. Working multiple jobs. In their minds, the entire narrative was already written. Few of them ever bothered asking what really happened. Emma walked over carrying a box of decorations. "Mom, where should these go?" Rachel immediately smiled. "Right over there beside the display." Emma nodded and hurried off again. Linda watched the interaction from across the room before speaking once more. "I just feel bad for the girl," she said. "Growing up without the life she could have had." This time several people exchanged glances. The comment lingered in the air. Rachel quietly placed another stack of forms onto the table. She knew the assumptions. Everyone did. Her marriage had ended nearly 7 years earlier. Her former husband had left town shortly afterward. Since then, Rachel had raised Emma alone while balancing multiple jobs and endless responsibilities. To outsiders, her life looked like a cautionary tale. A woman who had somehow fallen behind while everyone else moved ahead. What they never saw were the nights she stayed awake helping Emma study. The mornings she left home before sunrise. The sacrifices she made so her daughter could participate in school trips, sports programs, and music lessons. They saw struggle. They never saw strength. The meeting eventually concluded and volunteers began folding chairs. Parents collected children. Conversations drifted toward weekend plans and holiday schedules. As Rachel gathered supplies, Emma approached holding a ribbon she had won for helping organize the event. "Look, Mom." Rachel smiled warmly. "I am proud of you." Emma grinned. "Can we put it on the refrigerator?" "Absolutely." Together they carried boxes toward the exit. As they passed the refreshment table, Rachel caught part of another conversation. "I suppose some people just get stuck," Linda said. Rachel kept walking. Emma looked up at her mother. "Did they mean you?" Rachel considered the question. Outside, the late afternoon sky glowed orange above the town square. Cars moved slowly along Main Street while leaves drifted across the sidewalk. She placed a hand gently on Emma's shoulder. "People only see a small part of other people's lives," she said softly. "That is why it is important to be kind." Emma thought about that for a moment before nodding. Neither of them noticed the luxury black sedan parked briefly across the street before driving away. Inside sat an elderly man watching the community center through the window. His silver hair caught the fading sunlight as his thoughtful eyes followed Rachel and Emma walking toward their aging pickup truck. He remained there only a few seconds before the vehicle disappeared into traffic. Rachel never saw him. She never knew he was there. And she certainly never imagined that the stranger's name would one day change everything. The alarm clock beside Rachel Morgan's bed rang at 5:15 every morning, long before the sun appeared over Cedar Grove. Most days she was already awake. Years of responsibility had trained her body to rise before necessity demanded it. The small house she rented sat near the edge of town, where quiet streets met open fields and rows of maple trees. It was not impressive. The paint needed attention. The porch creaked when someone stepped on it. The kitchen was small enough that two people could barely move around at the same time. Yet to Rachel and Emma, it was home. That morning, as pale blue light slowly entered through the curtains, Rachel stood at the stove preparing pancakes while reviewing a grocery list she had written the night before. Every dollar had a purpose. Every purchase required consideration. Emma entered the kitchen wearing an oversized sweatshirt and carrying a science textbook beneath one arm. "Morning, Mom," she said with a yawn. Rachel smiled. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you finish studying?" Emma nodded proudly. "I stayed up until 10. Then tonight you are going to bed earlier." Emma laughed and slid into a chair. The smell of coffee filled the room while the radio quietly delivered local weather updates. Moments like these were simple, but Rachel treasured them. They reminded her why every sacrifice mattered. After breakfast, Rachel drove Emma to school in their aging pickup truck before heading to her first job. The grocery store sat on the opposite side of town near a busy shopping center. She spent the morning stocking shelves, helping customers, and managing inventory. By noon, she left for her second responsibility. Several afternoons each week, she worked part-time assisting with bookkeeping for a small construction company. The owner appreciated her reliability. The pay was modest, but every extra hour helped. Most people only saw the jobs. They never saw the purpose behind them. Rachel was not merely surviving. She was building stability one day at a time. Late that afternoon, she arrived at Emma's school just in time for a parent showcase event. Students displayed projects throughout the gymnasium while families walked from table to table. Emma stood beside a presentation about renewable energy, enthusiastically explaining her work to visitors. Rachel listened from a distance with pride shining in her eyes. Nearby, several parents discussed college plans, vacations, and future opportunities for their children. Rachel occasionally noticed familiar expressions when conversations turned toward finances. Some people assumed Emma lacked possibilities because her mother lacked wealth. Rachel had stopped trying to correct those assumptions years ago. Results would eventually speak louder than explanations. After the event ended, Rachel and Emma stopped at a local diner for dinner. They shared a booth beside the window and split a meal to save money. Emma talked excitedly about school while Rachel listened carefully. Outside, evening traffic moved slowly beneath glowing streetlights. Across town, people gathered in larger houses and attended more expensive restaurants. Rachel did not envy them. She only hoped to provide a future where Emma could choose her own path. When they finally returned home, Emma settled at the kitchen table to complete homework while Rachel sorted bills and reviewed next week's schedule. The numbers required careful balancing. Rent. Utilities. School expenses. Fuel. Groceries. Unexpected costs always seem to arrive at the worst possible time. Yet somehow she managed. Not perfectly. But consistently. Near 10 o'clock, Emma carried a blanket into the living room and curled up beside her mother on the sofa. "Mom?" she asked softly. "Yes. Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" Rachel looked at her daughter for a moment. It was a surprisingly grown-up question. "Sometimes," she admitted honestly. "But not because of you." Emma smiled. Rachel gently brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Life does not always go the way we expect. That does not mean it cannot still become something beautiful." Emma seemed satisfied with the answer. Within minutes she had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder. Rachel remained awake a little longer. Through the front window, she watched the quiet street beneath the glow of a single street lamp. The town saw a divorced mother working multiple jobs. A woman people occasionally pitied. Someone they assumed had been left behind by life. What they did not see was resilience. They did not see discipline. They did not see the countless choices made out of love rather than convenience. And somewhere beyond Cedar Grove, events were already beginning to move that neither Rachel nor Emma could possibly anticipate. The future was quietly approaching, carrying answers to questions they had never thought to ask. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the most important chapter in a story you do not even know you are writing. The memory returned to Rachel Morgan unexpectedly on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She had been organizing receipts at the construction company's office when she noticed an elderly customer struggling to open the front door while carrying several folders. Without thinking, she stood and helped him inside. The man thanked her with a warm smile before continuing on his way. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it stirred something familiar. Later that evening, as rain tapped softly against her windshield during the drive home, Rachel found herself remembering another storm many years earlier. It had happened long before the divorce. Long before Cedar Grove became a place where people whispered about her circumstances. At the time, Emma had been only 5 years old. Rachel had been driving home from work after picking her daughter up from daycare. Heavy rain had fallen across the highway, reducing visibility and slowing traffic to a crawl. Most drivers focused on getting home. Rachel had done the same until she noticed an elderly man standing beside a disabled sedan near the shoulder of the road. Vehicles passed without stopping. Some drivers probably never saw him. Others likely assumed someone else would help. Rachel almost continued driving herself. After all, she had a tired child in the back seat and very little extra time. But something about the man's expression made her hesitate. She pulled onto the shoulder several hundred feet ahead and parked. Emma looked up from her coloring book. "What happened?" Rachel smiled. "Someone needs help." Together they walked through the rain toward the stranded vehicle. The older man stood beside the car holding an umbrella that offered little protection against the wind. Water soaked the sleeves of his coat. "Are you all right?" Rachel asked. The man looked surprised that anyone had stopped. "I believe so," he replied. "The car seems to disagree." Rachel laughed softly. "Do you need me to call someone?" The man explained that his phone battery had died and roadside assistance had never arrived. Rachel immediately offered her phone. After several unsuccessful calls, she learned that assistance would take at least 2 more hours due to weather conditions. The man nodded politely but looked disappointed. The temperature continued dropping. Emma stepped forward and held out a small package of crackers she had been saving from daycare. "You can have these," she said. The man blinked before accepting them. "Thank you." Rachel noticed his hands trembling slightly from the cold. Without hesitation, she returned to her truck and retrieved a blanket from the back seat. "You should use this until help arrives." The man protested. Rachel insisted. For nearly 30 minutes, they stood beside the road talking while rain continued falling around them. The conversation remained simple. Family. Weather. Life. Nothing remarkable. The man never introduced himself beyond saying his first name was Charles. He seemed intelligent, thoughtful, and unusually interested in Emma's stories about school. When roadside assistants finally arrived, he thanked them repeatedly. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and offered Rachel several $100s. She immediately shook her head. "No, please," he said. "You helped me." Rachel smiled. "Then help someone else someday." The man looked at her for a long moment. People do not say things like that very often anymore. Rachel simply shrugged. Maybe they should. They drove away moments later and never expected to see him again. Life continued. Years passed. The memory gradually faded beneath responsibilities, bills, school events, and ordinary struggles. Back in the present, Rachel pulled into her driveway and sat quietly for a moment as the rain continued falling outside. She was not sure why the old memory had returned. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it was simply one of those forgotten moments that occasionally resurfaced without explanation. Inside the house, Emma was already preparing dinner while reviewing homework assignments at the kitchen table. Rachel smiled as she entered. The familiar warmth of home immediately replaced the gloomy weather outside. Neither of them knew that somewhere far beyond Cedar Grove, the elderly man from that rainy highway had never forgotten their kindness. While Rachel remembered only a brief encounter from years ago, he remembered something very different. He remembered the day a struggling young mother and her little girl stopped when nobody else would. And although Rachel had no way of knowing it, that forgotten act of kindness was slowly moving back toward her life in ways she could never have imagined. The headline appeared on a Monday morning while Rachel Morgan was stocking shelves in aisle 7 of the grocery store. She almost missed it. A customer had left a newspaper folded on top of a shopping cart near the front entrance. During a quiet moment, Rachel glanced down and noticed a photograph occupying nearly half the front page. The face looked familiar. Older than she remembered. More distinguished. Yet something about the man's eyes immediately captured her attention. Above the image, bold black letters stretched across the page. Charles Whitmore, billionaire industrialist, passes away at 72. Rachel froze for a moment. The name echoed through her memory. Charles. Rain. Highway. A stranded vehicle. An elderly man accepting a blanket from a little girl. She stared at the photograph again. It could not be. Yet somehow she knew it was. Several customers passed by while Rachel remained standing beside the cart. 7 years had passed since that stormy afternoon. She had never learned the man's last name. Never asked what he did for a living. Never expected to hear about him again. And now his face stared back at her from the front page of a newspaper. Later that afternoon, during her lunch break, Rachel searched for more information using her phone. Article after article appeared. Charles Whitmore had built one of the largest investment and manufacturing empires in the country. His companies employed tens of thousands of people. His philanthropic foundations funded hospitals, educational programs, and community initiatives across multiple states. Financial analysts estimated his net worth in the billions. Rachel sat quietly at a picnic table behind the store, reading while autumn leaves drifted across the parking lot. The contrast felt almost impossible to process. The man she remembered had stood alone beside a disabled car in the rain, smiling gratefully as Emma offered him a package of crackers. Nothing about that encounter had suggested enormous wealth or influence. If anything, he had seemed refreshingly ordinary. As she continued reading, another detail caught her attention. Charles Whitmore had no surviving children. No immediate family members directly involved in the business empire he spent decades building. Financial reporters immediately began speculating about the future. Headlines questioned succession plans. Business networks debated inheritance scenarios. Experts predicted lengthy legal proceedings. Rachel eventually set the phone aside and returned to work. The news felt significant, but not personally significant. After all, she had met the man only once. The connection belonged to a brief chapter from the past. Life still required attention in the present. Emma still needed help with school assignments. Bills still needed to be paid. Responsibilities still filled every hour of every day. Across Cedar Grove, however, Charles Whitmore's death quickly became a popular topic of conversation. Residents discussed the story at diners, churches, and coffee shops. People marveled at the size of his fortune and speculated endlessly about who might inherit it. One afternoon, while Rachel waited in line at the local pharmacy, she overheard Linda Parker discussing the news with another customer. "Can you imagine leaving behind that kind of money?" Linda asked. "Whoever inherits it will never have to worry again." The other woman nodded. "Must be nice." Rachel paid for her purchase and quietly left. She had no interest in conversations about wealth she would never see and people she would never meet. Yet something about the story lingered in the back of her mind. That evening, Emma sat at the kitchen table working on algebra homework while Rachel prepared dinner. "Mom," Emma suddenly said, looking up from her textbook. "Was Charles Whitmore the man from the rainstorm?" Rachel turned from the stove. "You remember that?" Emma smiled. "Of course I remember. He ate my crackers." Rachel laughed softly. "Yes. I think it was him." Emma considered this. "That is strange. Life can be strange sometimes." Emma nodded and returned to her homework. Outside, darkness settled across Cedar Grove while distant streetlights flickered on one by one. Somewhere far beyond the small town, teams of attorneys, executives, and advisors were already gathering to address the future of Charles Whitmore's estate. Confidential meetings filled boardrooms. Legal documents were reviewed. Long-held secrets quietly moved toward the surface. Rachel knew nothing about any of it. She finished washing dishes, helped Emma prepare for school the next day, and eventually settled into bed exhausted from another ordinary Monday. Before turning off the lamp, she glanced briefly at the newspaper article she had clipped and placed on her nightstand. The photograph showed Charles smiling confidently during a business event years earlier. Rachel smiled back at the image. "I hope you found peace," she whispered softly. Then she turned off the light. What she did not know was that somewhere inside a locked legal file bearing Charles Whitmore's signature, her own name had already been waiting for years. 3 weeks passed after the news of Charles Whitmore's death, and life in Cedar Grove continued much as it always had. Autumn slowly surrendered to early winter. The maple trees lining Main Street lost the last of their leaves, and cold winds drifted across the town square each morning. Rachel Morgan remained focused on the same priorities that had guided her for years. Work. Bills. Emma. Stability. Everything else existed somewhere far beyond the boundaries of daily necessity. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, she finished a bookkeeping shift and returned home earlier than usual. Emma would not be home from school for another hour, and for once the house was completely quiet. Rachel welcomed the rare moment. She placed groceries on the kitchen counter, started a load of laundry, and sat down at the table with a cup of coffee. The silence lasted less than 10 minutes before someone knocked on the front door. Assuming it was a delivery driver or a neighbor, Rachel opened it without concern. Standing on the porch was a man in an expensive dark coat carrying a leather briefcase. He appeared to be in his 50s, professional, composed, and entirely out of place in Cedar Grove. "Mrs. Rachel Morgan?" he asked politely. Rachel nodded. "Yes." The man extended a business card. "My name is Thomas Bennett. I represent Whitmore, Lawson, and Pierce." Rachel glanced at the card. The name meant nothing to her. "I am sorry," she said. "Have we met?" "No," Thomas smiled professionally. "I have been attempting to contact you for several days." Rachel frowned. "About what?" The attorney paused briefly, as though choosing his words carefully. I am here regarding the estate of Mr. Charles Whitmore. For a moment, Rachel simply stared at him. The name immediately pulled her back to the newspaper article and the memories of that rainy highway years ago. Charles Whitmore, she repeated. Yes. Rachel felt genuine confusion. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. Thomas opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope bearing the letterhead of a large law firm. Mr. Whitmore specifically requested that this invitation be delivered personally. Rachel accepted the envelope but did not open it immediately. The entire situation felt surreal. Invitation? She asked. Thomas nodded. A formal gathering regarding the reading of Mr. Whitmore's estate documents will take place next Friday in Seattle. Rachel blinked. Why would I be invited to something like that? The attorney's expression remained calm. Unfortunately, I am not authorized to discuss details. Rachel looked at the envelope again. I met Mr. Whitmore exactly once. I understand. Years ago. Yes. Rachel shook her head. There has to be some misunderstanding. Thomas offered a small smile that revealed absolutely nothing. I assure you, Mrs. Morgan, there is not. After answering a few logistical questions, he left as unexpectedly as he had arrived. Rachel remained standing on the porch holding the envelope long after his vehicle disappeared down the street. The cold air barely registered. Her thoughts moved too quickly. Eventually she returned inside and sat at the kitchen table. The envelope remained unopened before her. Several minutes passed before she finally broke the seal. Inside was a formal letter inviting her to attend a private estate proceeding at Whitmore Tower in downtown Seattle. Travel arrangements would be provided. Accommodation would be provided. Attendance was strongly requested. Nothing else. No explanation. No clues. No answers. By the time Emma arrived home from school, Rachel was still staring at the letter. Mom? Emma asked. What happened? Rachel handed it to her. Emma read carefully. Her eyes widened. The Charles Whitmore? Rachel nodded slowly. Apparently. Emma looked up. Why would they want you there? Rachel laughed softly. I was hoping you knew. That evening, the mystery only deepened. News travels quickly in small towns, especially when something unusual happens. By the following afternoon, several neighbors had already heard about the attorney's visit. Rachel noticed curious looks while shopping for groceries. Linda Parker approached her near the produce section. I heard some fancy lawyer came looking for you. Rachel forced a polite smile. It was probably less exciting than it sounds. Linda raised an eyebrow. Does this have something to do with that billionaire? Rachel shrugged. I honestly do not know. Linda looked unconvinced. As always, speculation spread faster than facts. Yet for the first time in years, Rachel found herself wondering about possibilities she could not explain. Late that night, after Emma had gone to bed, Rachel sat alone beside the living room window holding the invitation once more. Snow had begun falling outside. Streetlights reflected against the white pavement. Somewhere in Seattle, powerful executives, attorneys, and advisors were preparing for a gathering connected to one of the largest fortunes in the country. And somehow, for reasons she could not understand, her name was on the guest list. The answer remained hidden. But for the first time, the future was no longer approaching quietly. It was knocking directly on her door. Friday arrived beneath a pale winter sky as Rachel Morgan and Emma drove toward Seattle before sunrise. The invitation had allowed Rachel to bring one guest, and after several days of uncertainty she decided there was no one she trusted more than her daughter. The pickup truck remained parked at home because the law firm had arranged transportation. A black sedan collected them from Cedar Grove shortly after dawn and carried them along the interstate toward the city. Neither spoke very much during the drive. The mystery surrounding the invitation had only grown over the past week. Every possibility Rachel considered seemed unreasonable. She had met Charles Whitmore once. One afternoon. One conversation. One act of kindness. Nothing more. Yet somehow she was now traveling to a private estate proceeding involving one of the largest fortunes in the country. Emma sat beside her watching the city skyline slowly appear in the distance. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Rachel smiled honestly. "Very." Emma laughed. "Me too." As they entered downtown Seattle, glass towers reflected the morning sunlight while pedestrians hurried along crowded sidewalks. The sedan eventually stopped in front of Whitmore Tower, a 40-story building that dominated several blocks of the financial district. Rachel stared upward through the window. She had seen photographs of the building online, but standing before it felt entirely different. Security staff greeted them at the entrance and escorted them through a marble lobby larger than some entire buildings in Cedar Grove. Everything about the environment seemed designed to remind visitors of influence, success, and wealth. Rachel suddenly felt very aware of her simple navy dress and practical winter coat. Yet Emma squeezed her hand gently. "You look great," she whispered. Rachel smiled. Together they entered a private elevator and ascended toward the upper floors. When the doors opened, they stepped into an executive conference center overlooking Elliott Bay. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed breathtaking views of the city, mountains, and water beyond. Around the room sat approximately 30 people. Some appeared to be attorneys. Others were executives, investors, business associates, and individuals Rachel recognized from news articles about Charles Whitmore's companies. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored suit sleeves. Quiet conversations filled the room. Confidence seemed to occupy every chair. Rachel immediately felt out of place. Several attendees glanced toward her and Emma before returning to their discussions. Nobody appeared to recognize them. Rachel preferred it that way. An assistant guided them toward seats near the back of the room. As they settled in, Emma leaned closer. "I think we are definitely the least important people here." Rachel laughed softly. "I was thinking the same thing." The meeting did not begin immediately. More guests continued arriving. Rachel observed the room carefully. Some people seemed nervous. Others appeared impatient. A few carried the unmistakable confidence of individuals expecting favorable outcomes. The atmosphere felt less like a memorial and more like a negotiation waiting to happen. Near 10 o'clock, a group of senior attorneys entered and took positions at the front of the room. Conversations gradually faded. Chairs turned toward the stage area. A large portrait of Charles Whitmore stood beside the podium. The image showed him smiling confidently during a charity event several years earlier. Seeing the photograph again stirred the same strange mixture of familiarity and disbelief. The man from the rainstorm. The billionaire. Somehow both descriptions belonged to the same person. The lead attorney, Thomas Bennett, stepped forward. Rachel immediately recognized him as the man who had delivered the invitation to her home. He welcomed everyone and briefly thanked them for attending. Then he explained that Charles Whitmore's estate planning process had been exceptionally detailed. Numerous charitable gifts, corporate transitions, and financial arrangements had already been established. Today's proceeding would address several remaining personal directives left by Mr. Whitmore himself. Rachel listened carefully but understood very little. Most of the discussion involved legal terminology and organizational matters far removed from her daily life. One by one, names were mentioned. Allocations were confirmed. Responsibilities were assigned. The process continued for nearly an hour. Several attendees appeared pleased. Others seemed disappointed. Rachel remained confused. She still had no idea why she had been invited. Then Thomas Bennett paused. He adjusted a folder resting on the podium and glanced toward the audience. The room became noticeably quieter. "The next section concerns a personal instruction written directly by Mr. Whitmore," he said. Several people immediately looked up. Even the attorneys seemed more attentive. Thomas opened the folder. "Mr. Whitmore requested that this matter be addressed separately." Rachel felt her pulse quicken slightly. Something in the room had changed. Expectations shifted. Curiosity sharpened. The attorney scanned the document briefly before speaking again. "The following directive concerns an individual whom Mr. Whitmore described as one of the most important people he ever met." A murmur moved through the audience. Rachel exchanged a puzzled glance with Emma. Neither had any reason to believe the statement involved them. In fact, Rachel was already wondering if this might finally explain why she had been invited as a witness. She had no idea that within the next few moments, every person in the room would turn toward her. The silence inside the conference room seemed to deepen as Thomas Bennett adjusted the document in his hands. Beyond the towering windows, ferries crossed Elliott Bay beneath a gray winter sky, but inside Whitmore Tower every eye remained fixed on the attorney standing at the podium. Rachel Morgan sat motionless beside Emma near the back of the room. She still believed she was little more than an observer. Whatever personal instruction Charles Whitmore had left behind, surely it concerned business partners, executives, or lifelong associates. People who belonged in a room like this. Not a divorced mother from Cedar Grove. Thomas glanced down at the page before continuing. "Mr. Whitmore wrote these words personally and requested they be read exactly as written." Several attendees leaned forward. The attorney cleared his throat. There are moments in life that reveal the true character of a person. Most people spend years searching for those moments. I found one unexpectedly on a rainy highway. A faint murmur moved through the room. Rachel felt a strange sensation in her chest. Her attention sharpened immediately. Thomas continued reading. "Many years ago, my vehicle failed during a severe storm. Hundreds of people passed. One person stopped. Rachel exchanged a glance with Emma. Neither spoke. She had no reason to help me. She did not know my name, my position, or my resources. She simply saw another human being who needed assistance." The room remained silent. Her daughter shared food with a stranger. The mother offered warmth, kindness, and time. When I attempted to reward her financially, she refused. Instead, she told me to help someone else someday. Several attendees looked puzzled. Others seemed intrigued. Thomas paused briefly before continuing. "I spent much of my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Influence. Opportunity. Access. Money. Yet. On that highway, I met someone who wanted nothing." Rachel's heartbeat accelerated. Emma slowly reached for her mother's hand beneath the table. Thomas turned a page. "Her name is Rachel Morgan." For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended between disbelief and confusion. Then heads began turning throughout the room. One by one, dozens of faces shifted toward the back. Toward Rachel. Toward the woman nobody had noticed when she entered. Rachel froze. Emma stared at the attorney. Neither knew how to react. Thomas looked directly toward them before continuing. "Mr. Whitmore requested that Rachel Morgan stand." Rachel blinked several times. Emma squeezed her hand. Slowly, uncertainly, Rachel rose from her chair. The room continued watching. Executives. Investors. Attorneys. Individuals accustomed to power and influence. Every eye remained fixed on her. Thomas resumed reading. "Rachel Morgan reminded me of something I had forgotten. The value of character when no reward is expected. The importance of kindness when nobody is watching." The attorney paused. "For that reason, I have chosen to leave a personal inheritance to Rachel Morgan and her daughter Emma Morgan." A collective gasp swept through the conference room. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. She could barely process the words. Around the room, expressions shifted from curiosity to astonishment. Several attendees exchanged confused whispers. Others simply stared. Thomas opened another folder. This inheritance includes a trust fund established for Emma Morgan's education and future development. Emma's eyes widened. Rachel instinctively placed a hand on her shoulder. In addition, Rachel Morgan shall receive a substantial financial bequest from my personal estate. The room erupted into murmurs. Attorneys remained composed, but many attendees no longer hid their surprise. Some people clearly recognized the significance of what had just been announced. Rachel did not. She was too overwhelmed to understand the details. Thomas waited for the room to settle before speaking again. The specific amount will be disclosed privately according to Mr. Whitmore's instructions. More whispers followed. Rachel looked around the room, completely overwhelmed. She had entered believing she did not belong. Now every person present seemed unable to stop looking at her. Thomas finally closed the folder. Mr. Whitmore also requested that a personal letter be delivered to Rachel Morgan immediately following today's proceedings. The attorney's voice softened. That letter remains sealed and will be presented after the meeting concludes. Rachel slowly returned to her seat. Emma looked equally stunned. Neither knew what to say. For years, Rachel had been the woman people overlooked. The woman people pitied. The woman some quietly mocked. Yet inside one of the most powerful buildings in Seattle, surrounded by people who spent their lives chasing wealth and influence, her name had just become the center of the entire room. And while the audience struggled to understand why, Rachel realized something even more remarkable. Charles Whitmore had remembered. Through years of success, boardrooms, investments, and billions of dollars, he had remembered a rainy afternoon that she herself had nearly forgotten. The inheritance was shocking. The attention was overwhelming. But neither compared to the realization that a simple act of kindness had mattered far more than she ever knew. And the sealed letter waiting for her promised answers that would change everything once again. The meeting concluded nearly an hour later, but Rachel Morgan remembered very little of what followed. Additional legal matters were discussed. Documents were reviewed. Questions were answered. Yet her thoughts remained fixed on a single reality that still felt impossible to understand. Charles Whitmore had remembered her. Not for a business deal. Not for an investment. Not because she possessed influence or power. He remembered her because she had chosen kindness on a rainy afternoon when nobody was watching. As attendees gradually began leaving the conference room, Thomas Bennett approached carrying a sealed cream-colored envelope. The room had changed noticeably since the announcement. People who had ignored Rachel earlier now looked at her differently. Some offered polite smiles. Others seemed curious. A few appeared openly bewildered. Rachel barely noticed. Her attention focused entirely on the envelope in Thomas's hands. "Mrs. Morgan," he said gently, "Mr. Whitmore requested that this be delivered directly to you after the reading." Rachel accepted it carefully. The paper felt surprisingly heavy. Her name appeared on the front in elegant handwriting. Emma stared at it beside her. "Are you going to open it?" she asked softly. Rachel looked toward Thomas. "Should I read it here?" The attorney smiled. "Mr. Whitmore left that decision entirely to you." For several seconds, Rachel simply held the envelope. Then she slowly broke the seal. Inside rested a handwritten letter spanning several pages. The writing was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably personal. Rachel immediately recognized the name signed at the bottom before she even read the first line. Charles. The conference room around her seemed to fade away as she began reading. "Dear Rachel, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and there are things I never had the opportunity to say in person." Rachel felt her throat tighten. The words carried none of the formal language present in the legal proceedings. This was not a billionaire writing to a beneficiary. It felt like a grandfather writing to family. She continued. You probably remember me as a stranded old man beside a broken car. What you did not know was that I spent most of my life surrounded by people who knew exactly who I was. Most treated me differently because of what I owned. You treated me kindly because I needed help. Emma leaned closer as Rachel read silently. Tears slowly gathered in her eyes. That afternoon stayed with me. Not because of the blanket. Not because of the phone call. Not even because of the crackers your daughter offered. I remembered because your actions reminded me of the kind of person I once hoped to be. Rachel paused briefly. The room remained quiet around her. Even Thomas waited respectfully. She continued reading. In business, I learned how to evaluate companies. In life, I learned how difficult it is to evaluate character. Yet sometimes character reveals itself in the simplest moments. You expected nothing from me. That is why I never forgot you. Rachel swallowed hard. Memories of the rainstorm returned with remarkable clarity. The cold air. The disabled vehicle. Emma holding out her snack. A conversation she had considered ordinary. Charles had seen something entirely different. Over the years, I occasionally checked on your circumstances. Not to interfere. Simply to understand whether the woman I met that day remained the same person. Rachel's eyes widened slightly. The realization suddenly explained several mysteries. The black sedan outside the community center. Certain anonymous donations that had occasionally appeared during local charity drives. Small moments she had never questioned. Charles had been watching from a distance. Never intruding. Never announcing himself. Simply observing. The letter continued. I watched you raise your daughter with dignity. I watched you continue choosing responsibility over convenience and kindness over bitterness. Every report confirmed what I already suspected. Wealth measures many things. Character is not one of them. Tears slipped quietly down Rachel's cheeks. Emma wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulder. Together they continued reading. The inheritance I leave behind is not payment. Kindness should never be treated as a transaction. Consider it an investment in two people who reminded an old man that goodness still exists. Use it however you believe will create opportunity, security, and hope. Rachel reached the final paragraph. Most people spend their lives chasing importance. You achieved it without trying. Thank you for stopping on a rainy day when everyone else kept driving. Thank you for raising a remarkable daughter. And thank you for proving that character still matters. With gratitude, Charles Whitmore. The room remained completely silent when Rachel lowered the letter. Even the attorneys appeared moved. For years, people in Cedar Grove had viewed her as someone unfortunate. Someone struggling. Someone left behind by life. Yet Charles Whitmore had seen something entirely different. He had seen strength hidden inside ordinary choices. He had seen value where others saw failure. And at that moment, Rachel realized the greatest gift he left behind was not the inheritance waiting in legal documents. It was the certainty that kindness, even when unnoticed, is never truly forgotten. Winter settled fully over Cedar Grove during the weeks that followed. Snow-covered rooftops, holiday lights appeared along quiet streets, and the small town continued its familiar routines. Yet for Rachel Morgan and Emma, life had changed in ways neither could have imagined. The inheritance Charles Whitmore left behind provided security that Rachel had never known. The education trust guaranteed opportunities for Emma's future. Financial burdens that once occupied every waking thought no longer dictated every decision. Yet the most remarkable change was not visible in a bank account. It was the sense of peace that gradually settled over their lives. Rachel continued working for several weeks after returning from Seattle. She needed time to process everything. More importantly, she wanted to remain grounded. The grocery store still opened each morning. The bookkeeping office still needed help. Life had always been built around responsibility, and she refused to let gratitude become entitlement. But eventually, with careful planning and guidance from trusted advisors, Rachel began making different choices. She reduced her workload. She spent more time with Emma. She started exploring ways to support local scholarships, community programs, and families facing the same struggles she once knew so well. One snowy afternoon, Rachel stood inside the community center where the annual Fall Harvest Festival had taken place months earlier. Volunteers gathered around folding tables discussing a youth mentoring initiative that lacked funding. Rachel listened quietly before making a simple offer that solved the problem immediately. The room fell silent. Several people stared at her in disbelief. News had already spread throughout Cedar Grove. Everyone knew about the inheritance. Everyone knew about Charles Whitmore. Everyone knew the divorced mother they had once pitied had somehow become connected to one of the largest estates in the country. What surprised people most was what Rachel did next. She never bragged. She never sought attention. She never reminded anyone how wrong they had been. She simply continued being herself. That made the lesson impossible to ignore. Linda Parker struggled with that reality more than anyone. For years she had viewed Rachel through the narrow lens of assumptions. She saw hardship and assumed failure. She saw divorce and assumed weakness. She saw financial struggle and assumed poor choices. Now every one of those assumptions stood exposed. One afternoon, Linda approached Rachel outside a local coffee shop. Snowflakes drifted gently through the air while shoppers moved along Main Street carrying holiday packages. "Rachel," Linda said hesitantly. Rachel turned and smiled politely. "Hello, Linda." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Linda looked down. "I owe you an apology." Rachel listened quietly. "I spent years thinking I understood your life." Linda shook her head. "I did not." Rachel smiled gently. "Most people only see part of the story." Linda nodded. There was nothing else to say. The apology was sincere. The lesson had already been learned. As Christmas approached, Rachel and Emma drove to Seattle one final time. Not for attorneys. Not for legal meetings. They visited a small park overlooking Elliott Bay where a memorial bench had recently been installed in honor of Charles Whitmore. The city skyline shimmered across the water while winter sunlight reflected off distant buildings. Rachel sat quietly beside Emma reading the inscription engraved into the plaque. It spoke about leadership, generosity, and the importance of helping others. Yet Rachel thought about something much simpler. A rainy highway. A broken car. A stranger who needed help. Emma traced the edge of the plaque with her fingers. "Do you think he knew all this would happen?" she asked. Rachel looked out across the bay. "I think he hoped something good would come from it." Emma smiled. "It did." Rachel nodded. "It certainly had. Not because of the money. Not because of the inheritance. Those things changed circumstances. The deeper gift was something else entirely. Charles Whitmore had reminded her that goodness matters even when nobody notices. Kindness matters even when there is no reward. Character matters even when the world refuses to see it. As the sun slowly began setting over Seattle, mother and daughter stood and started walking back toward their car. Behind them, the memorial bench overlooked the water in peaceful silence. Ahead of them stretched a future filled with possibilities neither had dared imagine. Years earlier, people laughed at a divorced mother because they believed her story was already written. They saw struggle and assumed defeat. They saw sacrifice and assumed failure. In the end, they discovered what Charles Whitmore understood all along. The most valuable things in life rarely announce themselves. They reveal themselves quietly through ordinary choices, everyday kindness, and the strength to keep moving forward when nobody is watching. And as Rachel and Emma disappeared into the fading winter light, they carried with them a truth greater than wealth itself. Dignity does not need to shout. It simply shines.